I'm Reverend Benjamin Broadbent, lead minister at the Community Church of Sebastopol, and welcome to my porch. As you can see behind me, it's raining a little bit, which we need here in Northern California, and I suppose right now this is as good a setting as any for a Palm Sunday sermon. This Lent we have been following the theme, Lent is a time for, and then we've been filling in the blank at the end. Today, the title of my sermon is Lent is a time for the Great Lampoon. By the end of the sermon, I hope you'll understand what I mean by the title. I'm actually preaching this sermon on April 4th, Saturday, and today is an important anniversary. This is the day in 1967 when the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his speech called Beyond Vietnam, a Time to Break the Silence. It was in that speech at the Riverside Church in New York City that Dr. King made connections between the civil rights work that he and many had been a part of and his resistance to the war in Vietnam. In that speech, he brought up what he called the three great evils of American empire: racism, extreme materialism, and militarism. And he talked about the three of these three great evils, how they worked together to create a kind of status quo of the way that our empire would be in the world. And as an alternative, he offered up what he called a true revolution of values. He said that America needed to adopt a new way of being in the world, and that we would either adopt that new way of being in the world or we would contribute to our mutual destruction. I think it's fitting to remember Dr. King's speech on April 4th in 1967 on this day before Palm Sunday. For in that speech, he was holding up a mirror to the American empire and revealing the absurdity of it all. A similar thing happens on Palm Sunday. We need to remember when we hear the Palm Sunday story that the story is told against the backdrop of empire, that is, the Roman Empire. John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg have done a wonderful job of telling the story of what all might have been happening on the day that we now call Palm Sunday. You see, it was the day not just of one parade and one procession into Jerusalem, but of two parades. On the opposite side of the city from the Mount of Olives, Pontius Pilate and a great retinue of soldiers would have been arriving. And they would have made a big deal about their arrival. These were macho men wanting to show that they were in charge. They would have had chariots and spears and swords, and Pilate himself would have been seated on a great war horse, probably with armor and with a scabbard at his side, wanting to show that he was the man in charge. You need to remember that this would have been at the beginning of the week of Passover. Passover being an important Jewish holiday which commemorated the liberation of the Jewish people from Egypt. And so all of Jerusalem was probably on pins and needles. It was a tense time. The empire in charge and the people celebrating liberation from empire. Pilate would have arrived with all of the soldiers, and they would have gone into the fortress that overlooked the temple square. They would have made sure that as many of the people would have seen how many weapons they had. They would have pointed out that their swords were sharpened and their spears were at the ready. It was a way of saying, you can all enjoy your little festival here, but just remember who's in charge. Just remember what could happen to you if you step out of line. So that is the backdrop to the story that we tell today. The story this year we're telling from Matthew chapter 21. When we hear the story, we might imagine that someone is creating and painting a picture. And they're creating and they're crafting that picture, drawing from different sources within the Hebrew Bible, or what we call the Old Testament. So let's consider a few of those pieces and help paint the picture. The first part of it is actually a sound or a word. It is voices calling out the word Hosanna. Hosanna comes from Psalm 118, verse 25. It's also pronounced Hosiana, which means save us. It is a collective cry by the people. Probably in the context of that psalm, it is being offered as an arriving military is coming in to free the city. Save us, they're saying. Hosiana, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, the one who is here to save us. So the first part of our picture is in fact a word, an exclamation by the people, Hosanna, save us. The second part is the palms that are give the name to our Sunday, Palm Sunday. I have something kind of like them here behind me. Why would the people have been taking leafy branches from the trees and waving them? Well, this part of the picture is drawn from Leviticus 23, where the festival of booths, or Sukkot, is described. There, the people are told you are to take leafy branches and the low-hanging fruits from the trees, and you are to make booths with them, booths to remind you of your liberation from Egypt and the time of sojourning in the wilderness before you were in the land that God would deliver to you. And so the waving of the palms and the singing of Hosanna now in the picture is a picture of liberation from empire. Next we have the cloaks that are laid down on the road, and Matthew brings in that cloak imagery. There's a place in 2 Kings chapter 9 where cloaks are laid down as the King Jehu comes in, and it is a sign of deference and respect to royalty. And so the people are laying their cloaks and their clothes down on the dusty trail as Jesus comes into Jerusalem. But I've left out one detail so far. It is the detail that Jesus made sure would be part of the procession. It's interesting in the text how Jesus tells his disciples to go and to do some preparation, tells them that you will find a donkey and a colt and that you are to get it ready. The donkey and the colt are drawn from the 9th chapter of Zechariah. Zechariah, the prophet, imagines the arrival of a liberator, of a king of sorts, into the city to liberate the people. But Zechariah, in his prophetic imagination, he imagines a different kind of royalty. Not someone filled with pride and machismo who is doing this all for his own ego's sake, but rather a king who comes in riding on a donkey. And some scholars have wondered whether Matthew mistranslates Zechariah, and it's possible. Zechariah talks about the donkey and on the colt of a donkey. Matthew picks that up and seems to suggest that Jesus is riding into Jerusalem not just on one, but on two animals. It's an absurd image. But maybe the absurdity of the image starts to suggest what this whole street theater protest is all about. The best description of why Matthew might have chosen that way to talk about it is that it wasn't just that it wasn't a war horse. It wasn't even a horse. It was a donkey. And it wasn't even a donkey. It was a mother donkey with her nursing colt next to her. That is the animal that Jesus chose to ride into Jerusalem that day. Do you see the lampoon, the making fun, the satire that is being created in this protest? On one side of the city, Pilate in all of his pomp, and on this side of the city, Jesus on a donkey. On this side of the city, all of these soldiers decked out in armor and with swords, and on this side of the city, all of the outcast, all of the marginalized, not with swords in their hands, but with branches, not laying down cloaks, but any bit of clothing they could find, calling out the word Hosanna. This whole scene is meant to hold up a mirror to empire and say, look at the absurdity of everything you claim for yourself. You claim to be in charge of everything and in charge of all of the people's lives, every aspect of their life, and yet you are not in control. The theological claim here, of course, is that God is in control, that God is the creator and the sustainer of our days. God is our protector, not Pilate on his horse, not some sword or some spear. And to point out the absurdity of all of that pretension, we have on this side Jesus riding on a lowly donkey. And a whole crowd of people, some who may never have heard about Jesus before, but they're caught up in the moment of it all, and the pageantry, and the singing, and the celebration. And when they arrive into Jerusalem, what is it that Jesus does? He starts to heal people. He looks at the crowd, and he looks at their affliction, and he looks at the ways in which they've been marginalized, and he chooses to act out God's mercy and love by providing them liberation from the oppression of the empire right there in the moment by way of his hands. One more thing to point out about this picture. It's the beginning of the picture of all of Holy Week. We will be walking together as a people through this week. And we know where it ends. Well, at least we think we know. At first we think it ends at the cross. And the cross, I think, is the greatest lampoon of empire. The cross is the symbol that exposes the great pretension of the violence of the empire. It says, your violence, look at what it leads to. It leads to the crucifixion of one who came speaking peace. It leads to the crucifixion of one who is called Son of God, the very embodiment of God's love on earth. That is the result of the violence of empire. But the story, of course, doesn't end there, does it? 3 days later, 2 days, depending on how you count it, people go to the tomb. The women arrive with spices. They think the end of the story has been told. But there they find an empty tomb. And so beyond the Great Lampoon is the great proclamation that God, who comes riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, bringing healing and love and speaking peace, cannot be defeated by the empire, cannot even be silenced by death, but has risen, and risen to walk among us, that we, too, might be part of that great procession